Hey guys, tonight we begin with revenge. Not the petty kind, not the kind where you unfollow someone or leave a passive-aggressive note on the fridge. No, tonight we're talking about the kind of revenge that required an entire army, crossed the North Sea, and brought 4 English kingdoms to their knees. We're talking about sons who watched their father die in a pit of snakes and decided that one king's death wasn't enough. They wanted a country. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was 865 AD, when the largest Viking force ever assembled landed on the shores of East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, not known for its dramatics, called it the Micel Heathen Heer, the Great Heathen Army. And for once, the name wasn't an exaggeration, but to understand why they came, we need to go back. Back to a man who may or may not have existed, whose legend grew so large that separating truth from myth became impossible centuries ago. A man whose death would cost England nearly everything. We need to talk about Ragnar Lothbrok. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Ragnar Lothbrok. We don't actually know if he was real. I know, I'm sorry. You came here for Viking revenge and I'm already ruining things. But stay with me, because the uncertainty is part of what makes this story so fascinating. The man we call Ragnar Lothbrok exists in that hazy space between history and legend, where the campfire tales of warriors slowly calcified into something that felt like fact. The sagas speak of him as if he were as real as the ground beneath your feet. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, the tale of Ragnar's sons. Poems and stories passed down through generations of Scandinavians who needed their heroes larger than life. And Ragnar? Ragnar was enormous. His nickname, Lothbrok, probably meant shaggy breeches or hairy breeches. Already we're off to a dignified start. The story goes that he earned this name by wearing specially made trousers boiled in pitch and rolled in sand to protect himself from a giant serpent, or possibly a dragon. The sagas weren't overly concerned with zoological accuracy. According to legend, a Swedish king named Herauther had a daughter whose pet snake grew into a monstrous serpent that terrorized the land. Because of course it did. No one in early medieval Scandinavia apparently knew when to stop feeding a pet. The king promised his daughter's hand to whoever could slay the beast, and young Ragnar showed up in his ridiculous protective trousers and killed it. The daughter's name was Thora. She became his first wife. She gave him sons, and then she died, as wives in sagas unfortunately tend to do, usually to make room for the next plot development. But here's where things get interesting. Because Ragnar's second wife wasn't just any woman. Her name was Aslaug, and she claimed to be the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhilde. Yes, that Sigurd, the dragon slayer from the Volsung saga. Aslaug was supposedly raised in secret after her parents' deaths, hidden inside a harp and carried across the land by her foster father. Hidden inside a harp. Look, I'm just telling you what the sagas say. I don't make the rules. When Ragnar's men discovered Aslaug, she was living as a peasant girl, so beautiful that they forgot to bring back bread for their king. Ragnar, intrigued by any woman capable of making grown Vikings forget about bread, sent for her. He devised a riddle. She must come to him neither dressed nor undressed, neither hungry nor full, neither alone nor accompanied. Aslaug arrived wrapped in a fishing net, biting an onion, with only a dog by her side. Reader, he married her. And it was Aslaug who gave Ragnar the sons that matter to our story. Ivar, Bjorn, Fitzak, Sigurd, Ubba. Names that would become synonymous with conquest and terror across the medieval world. Now, you might be wondering, if we're not sure Ragnar was real, why are we spending so much time on him? Because his sons were definitely real. Their conquests are documented not just in Norse sagas, but in English chronicles, Frankish records, and Irish annals. The great heathen army that landed in 865? That was real. The kingdoms that fell? Very real. The kings who died? Absolutely, unfortunately, historically real. And every single source agrees on one thing. Those sons believed they were avenging their father. Whether Ragnar Lothbrok was one man or a composite of several Viking leaders whose legends merged over time, or a mostly mythical figure onto whom real sons attached their lineage for prestige, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that by the mid-9th century, there existed a group of Danish warriors who called themselves the Sons of Ragnar. And they were about to change the map of Europe. But first, let's talk about what Ragnar, real or legendary, actually did to earn his reputation. The raids on Francia made him famous. In 845 AD, a Viking fleet of approximately 120 ships sailed up the Seine River toward the heart of the Frankish kingdom. The man leading them was identified in Frankish sources as Ragnar, though whether this was our Ragnar Lothbrok is, you guessed it, uncertain. What is certain is the devastation. King Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne himself, scrambled to respond. He divided his army to defend both banks of the Seine, which turned out to be exactly the wrong strategy against Vikings who had spent their entire lives navigating waterways. Ragnar attacked one half of the Frankish army, slaughtered them, and then, in a move of pure psychological warfare, hanged 111 prisoners on an island in the Seine where the other half of the army could watch. The remaining Franks, understandably, declined to fight. On March 28th, 845 AD, Easter Sunday, because Vikings had a dark sense of timing, Ragnar's forces sacked Paris. The great city of the Franks, the jewel of the Carolingian Empire, fell to Scandinavian raiders. Churches were plundered, monasteries burned, the accumulated wealth of generations carried off to longships waiting in the river. And what did King Charles do? He paid them to leave. £7,000 of silver. That was the price of making the Vikings go away. It was the first major Danegeld, a tribute payment that would become a recurring feature of European politics for the next 2 centuries. Charles didn't know it yet, but he had just taught every Viking in Scandinavia an important lesson. The Franks would pay to avoid a fight. Ragnar sailed home with enough treasure to fund a legend. The sagas also credit him with raids on England, though the historical record is murkier here. What we know for certain is that by the mid-9th century, Viking raids on the British Isles had escalated from seasonal smash-and-grab operations into something more organised, more persistent, and far more dangerous. Monasteries were the primary targets. Lindisfarne had been hit back in 793, that famous raid that traditionally marks the beginning of the Viking Age. Iona fell in 795, Jarrow in 794. These were soft targets, wealthy religious communities with gold, silver, and illuminated manuscripts, defended by monks whose combat training consisted primarily of aggressive praying. But as the decades passed, the Vikings grew bolder. They established winter camps. They extracted tribute. They started to notice that these fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, always squabbling among themselves, might be ripe for something more ambitious than raiding. Ragnar, according to legend, noticed too. And that's when he made his fatal mistake. The story of Ragnar's death is almost certainly more legend than history. But it's the story his sons believed, and that's what matters. According to the sagas, Ragnar had grown old and restless. His sons were out earning their own glory, Bjorn raiding in the Mediterranean, Ivar building his reputation as a tactical genius, the others carving their names into the trembling hearts of various European populations. Ragnar, left behind, decided he had one more great raid in him. But he didn't want to simply match his son's achievements. He wanted to surpass them. And so, with characteristic Viking humility, he ordered the construction of only 2 ships and set sail for England with a skeleton crew. 2 ships to conquer a kingdom. This was either supreme confidence or the beginning of a death wish. The sagas frame it as a test of fate, a final chance to prove that the old wolf still had teeth. Modern readers might recognize it as the kind of decision men make when they're not quite ready to admit they've aged out of their profession. Ragnar landed in Northumbria, the northernmost of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and began raiding. At first, things went well, but Northumbria wasn't a monastery. It had an army. It had a king. His name was Allah. The historical Allah is a shadowy figure, a usurper who had recently seized the Northumbrian throne in a coup against King Osbert. He was not a popular king. He was not a particularly stable king. But he was, unfortunately for Ragnar, a king who happened to be present with an army when a small Viking force got too confident. The battle was short. Ragnar's 2 ships' worth of men were no match for the Northumbrian forces. The Vikings were slaughtered, and Ragnar himself was captured. What happened next depends on which source you believe. The most famous version, the one his sons certainly believed, goes like this. King Alla, wanting to make an example of the famous Viking raider, ordered Ragnar thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. It's a dramatic image. The legendary warrior, conqueror of Paris, brought low by creatures slithering in the darkness of a Northumbrian dungeon. Ragnar, the sagas say, remained defiant to the end. He sang a death song, a poem recounting his many battles and victories, showing no fear even as the venom began to work. His final words, according to legend, were a warning. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. The little piglets, of course, were his sons, and they would do a lot more than grunt. Now, here's where I have to put on my historian hat for a moment, which, admittedly, clashes with my narrator robe, but bear with me. The snake pit story is almost certainly fiction. It's too neat, too dramatic, too perfectly designed to justify what came next. Real medieval executions were usually simpler. Beheading, hanging, the occasional creative mutilation for political enemies. A pit of snakes sounds less like Anglo-Saxon justice and more like something dreamed up by a saga poet who wanted to give the sons of Ragnar the most emotionally compelling origin story possible. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter if it's true. What matters is that by the early 860s, a group of Danish warriors who called themselves the Sons of Ragnar Lothbrok were preparing the largest military expedition the Viking world had ever seen. They claimed their father had been murdered by the king of Northumbria. They claimed they were owed blood. And in 865 AD, they came to collect. The great heathen army was about to change everything. Before we march with the great heathen army, we need to understand the men who led it. Because these weren't just random Vikings who showed up for plunder. These were brothers, each with their own reputation, their own skills, and their own terrifying nickname. Let's meet the family. Ivar the Boneless. Even among Vikings, Ivar stood apart. His nickname has puzzled historians for over 1,000 years. Boneless? What could it possibly mean? Some saga accounts suggest he had a physical condition that prevented him from walking. Osteogenesis imperfecta, perhaps. Brittle bone disease. The sagas describe him being carried into battle on a shield, directing the fight from above while his men did the actual killing. If true, this makes his reputation even more remarkable. A man who couldn't walk became the most feared military commander of his age. Other interpretations are less literal. Boneless might have been a poetic way of describing someone unusually flexible, or someone whose movements in battle were serpentine and unpredictable. Some scholars have suggested, rather indelicately, that the nickname referred to impotence, a reading that the sagas seem to support when they mention Ivar had no children because he had no lust. But here's what everyone agreed on. Ivar was brilliant. While his brothers were known for their physical prowess in battle, Ivar was known for his mind. He was the strategist, the planner, the one who looked at a map of England and saw not just targets for raiding, but a puzzle to be solved. Where others saw 4 separate kingdoms, Ivar saw 4 sets of weaknesses to exploit. The sagas describe him as having the sharpest mind of all his brothers, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cunning. When the great heathen army made decisions that seemed counterintuitive, landing in East Anglia but marching north, accepting tribute when they could have fought, waiting when they could have attacked, those decisions usually had Ivar's fingerprints on them. He was the brain of the operation, and in 865, that brain was entirely focused on one goal: the destruction of King Ella and the conquest of Northumbria. Bjorn Ironside. If Ivar was the mind, Bjorn was the legend. The eldest of Ragnar's sons by Aslaug, Bjorn had already carved out a reputation that rivaled his father's. While his brothers were preparing to invade England, Bjorn had been busy terrorizing the Mediterranean. A Viking expedition so audacious, it still seems barely believable. In the early 860s, Bjorn led a fleet through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean Sea. Think about that for a moment. Vikings in the Mediterranean. These were men from Scandinavia, from lands of ice and dark winters, suddenly appearing off the coasts of Spain, North Africa, and southern France. They sacked Algeciras. They raided the Moroccan coast. They sailed up the Rhone River and plundered Arles. And then, according to later sources, they hit Italy itself. The story goes that Bjorn's fleet approached the city of Luna, which the Vikings mistakenly believed was Rome. Finding the walls too strong for a direct assault, Bjorn came up with a plan worthy of the Trojan horse. He sent messengers to the city, claiming that their leader had died and wished to be buried in consecrated ground as a Christian. The people of Luna, moved by this apparent deathbed conversion, opened their gates to receive the body for proper burial. The coffin was carried into the cathedral. Prayers were said, and then, in the middle of the ceremony, the coffin lid burst open and Bjorn leapt out, very much alive, sword in hand. The gates were seized, the Vikings poured in, Luna was sacked. Now, this story is almost certainly embellished, if not entirely fictional. Similar tales were told about other Viking leaders, and it has the feel of a story too good to fact-check. But it tells us something about Bjorn's reputation. He was seen as a trickster, a man who combined his father's audacity with a flair for the theatrical. By the time the great heathen army was assembling, Bjorn was the most famous Viking alive. His presence gave the invasion legitimacy, prestige, and the kind of name recognition that made English kings nervous. Whether Bjorn actually participated in the full English campaign is debated. Some sources suggest he returned to Scandinavia after the initial invasion, others that he remained. But his name was attached to the army, and in the 9th century, names meant everything. Halfdan Ragnarsson. Where Ivar was cunning and Bjorn was legendary, Halfdan was relentless. The historical record gives us more certainty about Halfdan than almost any other son of Ragnar. He appears repeatedly in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, always at the head of armies, always pushing forward. If Ivar was the architect of the invasion, Halfdan was the foreman who made sure the work got done. He would be there for the fall of Northumbria. He would be there for the conquest of Mercia. He would be there for the long campaigns against Wessex. And when the great heathen army finally began to settle down, taking land instead of just plunder, it was Halfdan who led the warriors turned farmers in Northumbria. But that was years in the future. In 865, Halfdan was simply one of the brothers, a proven warrior ready to avenge his father and claim a kingdom in the process. Sigurd Snake in the Eye. Now here's a nickname that demands explanation. According to the sagas, Sigurd was born with a mark in his eye that resembled a serpent eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. This was supposedly proof of his descent from the legendary Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, whose blood had marked the family line. Aslaug, remember, claimed to be the daughter of that Sigurd, and now here was her son, born with a dragon's mark in his very eye. It's a great story. It's almost certainly mythological embellishment designed to reinforce the family's legendary status. But Sigurd Snake in the Eye was real enough, appearing in multiple sources as one of the leaders of the great heathen army. He seems to have been less prominent than Ivar or Halfdan in the actual campaigns, but his presence mattered. Every son of Ragnar who stood on English soil was a reminder of why they had come. This wasn't a random raid. This was a blood debt, and the whole family was there to collect. Ubba. The sources are frustratingly vague about Ubba. Some traditions name him as a son of Ragnar. Others aren't sure. But he was definitely there in 865, one of the commanders of the great heathen army, and he would play a crucial role in the campaigns to come. Ubba appears most prominently in the later stages of the invasion, particularly in the war against Wessex. He was a warrior's warrior, a man who led from the front and died in battle. But more on that later. For now, just know that when the army landed, Ubba was among its leaders, adding one more name to the roster of Ragnar's Avengers. There may have been other brothers. The sagas mention Hvitserk, who may or may not have been another name for Halfdan. Some sources add more sons to the list. The truth is that the exact composition of Ragnar's family tree is impossible to reconstruct with certainty. But the core group, Ivar, Bjorn, Halfdan, Sigurd, Ubba, these were the men who led the great heathen army. These were the men who had grown up on stories of their father's glory. These were the men who had heard the tale of the snake pit, of King Ella's cruelty, of their father's defiant last words. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. Well, the piglets had grown up, and they were done grunting. Before we follow the army to England, there's one more piece of legend we need to address. The blood eagle. You may have heard of this. It's become one of the most infamous images associated with the Vikings. A ritual execution so brutal that it's hard to believe anyone actually did it. The victim's ribs were supposedly cut from the spine with a blade, then pulled outward to form a pair of wings. The lungs were then extracted and draped over these wings, and salt was poured into the wounds. The victim was alive for this. That was the point. According to the sagas, the sons of Ragnar had sworn to perform the blood eagle on King Ella. This was the fate that awaited the man who had thrown their father to the snakes. Not just death, but a death so spectacular, so horrifying, that it would echo through history. Now, here's the scholarly controversy. Did the blood eagle actually exist? Some historians argue it was a real ritual, reserved for the most hated enemies, a sacrifice to Odin, designed to send the victim to the afterlife in the worst possible way. Others argue it was pure literary invention, a misinterpretation of poetic descriptions of battlefield carnage that later writers took literally. The debate continues. What we know for certain is that the saga authors believed the blood eagle was real, and they believed the sons of Ragnar used it on King Ella. Whether that belief reflected actual history or a story too satisfying not to tell, we may never know. But as the great heathen army prepared to sail, the threat hung in the air. Allah had killed Ragnar, and Ragnar's sons were coming to make him regret it in ways that would make the snake pit look merciful. The year was 865 AD. Across Scandinavia, ships were being prepared. Warriors were saying goodbye to their families. Weapons were being sharpened, provisions gathered, and prayers offered to Odin for victory and to Thor for favourable winds. This was not going to be a raid. Raids were quick. Arrive in summer, grab what you could carry, leave before the local king could assemble an army. Vikings had been doing that to England for 70 years. It was practically a tradition. No, this was something different. This was an invasion, and everyone involved knew it. The fleet that assembled was enormous by the standards of the age. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't give us exact numbers, and the estimates that later sources provide are probably exaggerated. But we're likely talking about thousands of warriors. Some historians suggest between 3,000 and 5,000 men. Others go higher. What's certain is that this was the largest coordinated Viking force that had ever targeted England. And it was organised. That's the key difference between the great heathen army and every Viking force that had come before. This wasn't a collection of independent war bands who happened to be raiding in the same area. This was a unified command structure, with the sons of Ragnar at its head, pursuing a coordinated strategy. They had learned from their predecessors' mistakes. Earlier Viking armies had won battles, but failed to hold territory, because they lacked the numbers and the unity to resist counterattacks. great heathen army would be different. It was big enough to threaten kingdoms, organized enough to stay in the field for years, and led by men who weren't interested in quick profits. They wanted land, they wanted kingdoms, and they wanted revenge. In the autumn of 865, the fleet made landfall in East Anglia. Now, if you're thinking strategically, this might seem like an odd choice. The sons of Ragnar wanted vengeance against Northumbria, against King Alla specifically. Why not sail directly to Northumbria? Why land in the south? This is where Ivar's strategic genius becomes apparent. East Anglia was the weakest of the four major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It had a small population, limited military resources, and a king, Edmund, who wasn't prepared for an invasion on this scale. But it also had something the Vikings desperately needed: horses. You can't conquer a country on foot. Well, you can, but it takes forever, and your enemies can always outmaneuver you. The Vikings were expert sailors, but England wasn't a sea. To move quickly across land, to strike before the English could respond, to maintain the mobility that was essential to their way of war, the great heathen army needed horses. Lots of horses. So they didn't attack East Anglia, not yet. Instead, they made King Edmund an offer he couldn't refuse. Or rather, an offer he was too scared to refuse. The terms were simple. Give us horses, give us supplies, give us a winter camp, and we won't burn your kingdom to the ground. Let us use East Anglia as a staging area, and we'll direct our violence elsewhere. Edmund agreed. It's easy to judge him harshly for this. He essentially sold out the rest of England to save his own kingdom. But put yourself in his position. A fleet of Viking ships, more than he had ever seen, had just landed on his shores. The warriors coming ashore were led by men whose father's death song was probably already being sung in mead halls across Europe. Edmund had no allies nearby, no time to raise a proper army, and no realistic chance of winning a battle. So he made a deal with the devil, or rather, with 5 devils who happened to be brothers. The great heathen army spent the winter of 865-866 in East Anglia, resting, resupplying, and preparing. The warriors traded their sea legs for saddles. They gathered intelligence about the kingdoms to the north. They waited for the weather to turn, and King Edmund learned a lesson that England would learn over and over again in the coming years. Paying Vikings to go away was easy, but they always came back. And when they did, they remembered who had been helpful. When spring arrived, the army moved. They rode north, thousands of warriors on horseback, cutting across the English countryside with a speed that must have terrified anyone who saw them coming. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a migration. Families and entire communities fled before them, because everyone knew where they were going. Northumbria, King Ella's kingdom, the Snake Pit. The journey from East Anglia to York was approximately 150 miles. For an army moving on horseback, with supply wagons and the full logistics of an invasion force, This would have taken perhaps 1 to 2 weeks. 1 to 2 weeks for word to spread ahead of them, for panic to set in, for Ella to realize that his past had finally caught up with him. But here's the thing about Northumbria in 866. Ella had bigger problems than Vikings. Remember, Ella was a usurper. He had seized the throne from King Osbert in a coup, and Osbert was still alive, still angry, and still commanding the loyalty of a significant portion of the Northumbrian nobility. The kingdom was in the middle of a civil war when the sons of Ragnar arrived. Ivar must have known this. He must have timed the invasion precisely to exploit the chaos. Instead of facing a unified Northumbrian kingdom, the great heathen army was marching toward a divided nation at war with itself. The sons of Ragnar weren't just lucky, they were smart. In November of 866, the great heathen army reached York, or, as the Vikings would come to call it, Jorvik. The Romans had called it Eberacum. The Anglo-Saxons called it Eoforwic. It had been an important city for 1,000 years, strategically positioned at the confluence of rivers, protected by ancient walls that the Romans had built and the English had maintained. And on November 1st, 866, All Saints' Day, the Vikings took it without a fight. The Christian holiday was not a coincidence. The Vikings had learned that the English were particularly vulnerable on their religious festivals, when warriors might be at church instead of at their posts, when kings might be feasting instead of watching their walls. All Saints' Day was supposed to be a celebration of Christian triumph over death. For York, it became a day of conquest. The details of how the city fell are murky. The defences might have been undermanned due to the civil war, with loyalists of both Alla and Osbert more concerned with fighting each other than watching for external threats. The city's garrison might have been too small to hold the walls against such a massive force, or the Vikings might have simply moved so fast that no one had time to organise a proper defence. Whatever the reason, York fell. The seat of Northumbrian power, the ancient Roman fortress, the largest city in the north of England. It belonged to the sons of Ragnar now, and they settled in to wait. This is the part of the story where Ivar's patience becomes almost frustrating to read about. The Vikings had just taken the most important city in northern England. King Alla, their sworn enemy, was still out there somewhere. Every instinct says they should have pressed their advantage, hunted Alla down, finished what they came to do. Instead, they waited. They spent the winter in York, fortifying their position, resting their men, and letting the Northumbrian Civil War continue to weaken both sides. Every month that passed was another month for Alla and Osbert to exhaust their armies fighting each other. Every week was another week for the English to grow more desperate and more willing to make mistakes. Ivar was playing the long game. He understood something that many military leaders forget. Sometimes the best move is no move at all. Let your enemies destroy themselves. Save your strength for when it matters. The winter passed. The Vikings waited. And finally, in March of 867, the English came to them. What happened next is almost comical in its irony. Alla and Osbert, two men who had been trying to kill each other for months, realized they had a bigger problem. The Vikings weren't leaving. They were dug into York, and every day they stayed was another day that Northumbria lost its most important city. So the two rival kings did the unthinkable. They made peace with each other. After months of civil war, after whatever betrayals and bloodshed had led to Allah's coup in the first place, the two factions of the Northumbrian nobility set aside their differences and united against the common enemy. Osbert and Allah combined their armies into a single force, marched to York, and prepared to retake their city. It was exactly what Ivar had been waiting for. Think about it from the Viking perspective. Two English armies that had been weakening each other for months had just combined into a single target. Instead of having to hunt down Allah while watching their backs for Osbert, the sons of Ragnar now faced a unified enemy coming straight to them. An enemy that was exhausted from civil war, hastily patched together, and probably not used to fighting alongside men they had been trying to kill weeks earlier. The Northumbrians attacked York on March 21st, 867. They actually managed to breach the walls. The ancient Roman fortifications had gaps, and the Vikings hadn't had time to fully repair them. English warriors poured into the city, certain that victory was at hand. It wasn't. What happened inside the walls was a slaughter. The Vikings had prepared the city for exactly this scenario. The narrow Roman streets became kill zones. The breaches in the walls became traps, funneling the English into prepared positions where they could be cut down in detail. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Both Allah and Osbert died. Let me say that again, because it's remarkable. Both kings of Northumbria, the legitimate ruler and the usurper, the two men whose civil war had weakened the kingdom, the two men who had set aside their differences in a desperate attempt to save their homeland, both died in the same battle, on the same day, in the same city. Northumbria was decapitated, literally and figuratively. And now we come to the question everyone has been waiting for. What happened to Allah? Did the sons of Ragnar perform the blood eagle on the man who killed their father? Did they carve his ribs from his spine and pull out his lungs while he screamed? Did they finally have their revenge? The sagas say yes. They describe the ritual in vivid detail, claiming that Ivar himself performed the execution, that Allah suffered horribly, that the blood debt was paid in the most graphic way possible. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, perhaps mercifully, doesn't say. What we know for certain is that Allah died at York in March 867. Whether he fell in battle like any other warrior, or was captured and subjected to ritual execution, or something in between, the historical record doesn't tell us. But here's what I believe. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the sons of Ragnar had done what they came to do. The king who killed their father was dead. Northumbria, the kingdom that had executed Ragnar Lothbrok, had fallen. The Viking army that everyone had assumed just another raiding force had just conquered one of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And they were just getting started. The great heathen army didn't go home after York. They didn't declare victory and sail back to Denmark with their plunder. Instead, they installed a puppet king in Northumbria, a man named Egbert, who would rule in their name, and turned their attention south. There were 3 more kingdoms to deal with. Mercia was next. The great heathen army that had landed in 865 was not the same force that existed in 874. 9 years of campaigning had changed everything. Some of the original leaders were dead. Others had disappeared into the fog of history. The warriors who had crossed the North Sea as young men, hungry for glory, were now approaching middle age, and many of them had started to wonder if there might be more to life than endless warfare. They had conquered 2 kingdoms. They had humbled a 3rd. They had accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. And the land they had taken, Northumbria, East Anglia, parts of Mercia, that land needed to be farmed. Crops needed to be planted. Livestock needed to be raised. Someone had to do the actual work of turning a conquered territory into a functioning society. In 874, the great heathen army made a decision that would shape England for centuries. It split in 2. Halfdan Ragnarsson took his portion of the army north to Northumbria. The following year, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Halfdan shared out the land of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. Read that again. They proceeded to plough. These were Vikings. These were the men who had killed King Alla, who had martyred King Edmund, who had terrorized 4 kingdoms for nearly a decade. And now, they were farmers. They hung up their swords, claimed their plots of land, and started growing barley. It's one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval history. The warriors who had come to destroy England ended up building it. They married local women. They raised children who spoke a mixture of Old Norse and Old English. They established communities that would eventually become the towns and cities of northern England. The Danelaw was being born. But not everyone was ready to retire. Guthrum led the other half of the army. He was a Danish king, probably unrelated to the sons of Ragnar, who had joined the great heathen army at some point during its campaigns. While Halfdan was content to settle in Northumbria, Guthrum wanted what the original invasion had promised, but never delivered. He wanted Wessex. The tribute Alfred had paid in 871 had bought time, not peace. Guthrum knew that Wessex was the key to controlling all of England. As long as it remained independent, the Viking conquests in the north and east were vulnerable. Alfred could rebuild, form alliances, and eventually threaten everything the Danes had won. Guthrum was determined to finish what the sons of Ragnar had started. In 875, his army moved to Cambridge, positioning itself on the border between the Danelaw and Wessex. The following year, they slipped past Alfred's defences and seized Wareham, a fortified town deep in Wessex territory. Alfred responded by surrounding Wareham with his army. For the second time in his reign, he faced a Viking force dug into a defensive position. and for the second time, the standoff ended without a decisive battle. Guthrum swore oaths of peace. He gave hostages, high-ranking warriors whose lives would be forfeit if the Vikings broke their word. He promised to leave Wessex. It was a lie. Under cover of darkness, Guthrum's cavalry slipped out of Wareham and rode west to Exeter. They had broken their oaths before Alfred could react, abandoning their hostages to whatever fate awaited them. Alfred pursued, but by the time he reached Exeter, the Vikings were already fortified behind its Roman walls. Another siege, another standoff, another round of negotiations. This time, nature intervened. A Viking fleet of over 100 ships was sailing along the southern coast to reinforce Guthrum at Exeter. They never arrived. A massive storm struck the fleet off Swanage, wrecking the ships and drowning thousands of warriors. The reinforcements Guthrum had been counting on were scattered across the sea floor. Suddenly, the strategic situation had shifted. Guthrum was isolated in Exeter, his expected reinforcements destroyed, his army weakened by the long campaign. Alfred pressed his advantage, and the Vikings agreed to withdraw from Wessex entirely. This time, they actually left. Guthrum led his army into Mercia, where they spent the autumn and winter of 877 in relative peace. Alfred must have allowed himself a moment of hope. He had fought the Vikings to a standstill twice. He had survived storms of both the military and meteorological variety. His kingdom was battered, but intact. Perhaps the worst was over. It wasn't. The year was 878. January, the dead of winter. Alfred was at Chippenham, a royal estate in Wiltshire, celebrating the Christmas season with his court. This was the traditional time for Anglo-Saxon kings to feast with their nobles, to distribute gifts, to reinforce the bonds of loyalty that held a kingdom together. The fighting season was months away. The Vikings were in Mercia. For a brief moment, Alfred could pretend that things were normal. On the night of January 6th, 12th night, the end of the Christmas celebration, Guthrum struck. The Vikings had moved in secret, covering the distance from Mercia to Chippenham with a speed that should have been impossible in winter. They caught Alfred completely by surprise. His army was scattered across Wessex, celebrating the holiday with their own families. His defences were down. His court was full of revellers, not warriors. Guthrum had learned from the years of inconclusive campaigns. Direct assaults hadn't worked. Sieges hadn't worked. Oaths and treaties were just tools to buy time. If he wanted to destroy Wessex, he needed to cut off its head before the body knew it was under attack. He very nearly succeeded. Alfred escaped. Barely. The sources don't tell us how. Perhaps a servant raised the alarm. Perhaps Alfred had learned to sleep with one eye open. Perhaps it was simply luck. But while many of his nobles were captured or killed in the attack, the king himself fled into the winter darkness with a small band of followers. The kingdom of Wessex had just been decapitated. What followed was the lowest point in Alfred's life, and, paradoxically, the moment that would define his legend. He had no army. His nobles were scattered, captured, or dead. The Vikings controlled Chippenham, the heart of his kingdom. Much of the West Saxon aristocracy, seeing which way the wind was blowing, submitted to Guthrum and accepted Danish rule. Alfred was a king without a kingdom, a ruler without subjects, a warrior without an army. He retreated into the Somerset Levels, a vast expanse of marshland, bogs, and wetlands that covered much of southwestern England. It was miserable terrain, cold and wet, and nearly impossible to navigate if you didn't know the secret paths through the swamps. But that was exactly the point. The Vikings couldn't follow him there. Guthrum's cavalry was useless in the marshes. The hunters couldn't find their prey. Alfred established a base on a small island called Athelney, rising just above the waterline in the middle of the swamp. From this miserable refuge, with only a handful of loyal followers, the King of Wessex began plotting his comeback. This is where the famous legend of the burned cakes comes from. According to the story, Alfred sought shelter in the home of a peasant woman who didn't recognize him. She was baking bread and asked the stranger to watch her cakes while she attended to other chores. Alfred, preoccupied with his kingdom's survival, let the cakes burn. The woman returned and scolded him furiously for his carelessness. "You're happy enough to eat them when they're done, but you can't be bothered to watch them." The King of Wessex, humbled, accepted the rebuke in silence. It's almost certainly a later invention, one of those stories that gets attached to famous figures because it's too good not to tell. The image of a king brought so low that he's being yelled at by a peasant woman for burning bread is irresistible. It captures something essential about Alfred's situation in those dark months. Everything had been stripped away, and he had to rebuild from nothing. But, legendary or not, the story reflects a deeper truth. Alfred, in early 878, was not a conquering hero. He was a desperate man, hiding in a swamp, watching his kingdom fall apart, wondering if he would ever see his family again. Many men would have given up. They would have fled to the continent, sought refuge with Frankish relatives, accepted that England was lost. Some of Alfred's own nobles did exactly that, making their peace with Guthrum and accepting that the future was Danish. Alfred refused. The weeks in the swamp were not spent in despair. Alfred was planning. He sent messengers out into Wessex, reaching the nobles and warriors who had not yet submitted to the Vikings. He reminded them of their oaths to him. He told them that the fight wasn't over. he set a date and a place for the army of Wessex to reassemble. It was a gamble. If the messengers were captured, Guthrum would know exactly where to find him. If the nobles refused to come, Alfred would be exposed as a king without followers. If the Vikings discovered his hiding place before the army could gather, everything would be over. But Alfred understood something that Guthrum had missed. Conquest is not the same as control. The Vikings had seized Chippenham and scattered the West Saxon leadership, but they hadn't destroyed the bonds of loyalty that held the kingdom together. The nobles of Wessex had sworn oaths to Alfred, and oaths meant something in the 9th century. They meant more than convenience. They meant more than self-interest. They were sacred obligations, and many West Saxons were unwilling to break them, even when breaking them would have been the smart thing to do. The messengers went out. The word spread, and in early May of 878, something remarkable happened. They came from across Wessex. Warriors gathered at a place called Egbert's Stone on the edge of Selwood Forest. They came from Somerset, from Wiltshire, from Hampshire. They came despite the danger, despite the Vikings, despite every practical reason to stay home and accept the new order. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the scene with uncharacteristic emotion. When the warriors saw Alfred, alive and ready to fight, they were glad of him. They were glad of him. After months of hiding, months of uncertainty, months of wondering whether their king was dead, or fled, or broken, they saw him standing before them, not defeated, not destroyed, ready to take back his kingdom. Alfred had an army again. The king wasted no time. The very next day, he marched his reassembled forces toward the Viking-held territory. He moved quickly before Guthrum could learn of the muster and prepare a response. The element of surprise that had served the Vikings so well at Chippenham was about to be turned against them. The two armies met at a place called Eddington, probably modern Eddington in Wiltshire, though the exact location is debated. It was mid-May, 878. The fate of Wessex, and quite possibly all of England, hung in the balance. Alfred formed his men into a shield wall. This was the classic Anglo-Saxon formation. Warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, presenting an unbroken barrier of wood and iron to the enemy. It was a defensive formation, designed to absorb enemy charges and grind down attackers through sheer endurance. Guthrum's Vikings attacked. The Battle of Eddington was not elegant. Shield wall battles rarely were. Two masses of men crashed into each other and pushed, hacked, stabbed, and struggled until one side broke. There were no flanking maneuvers, no cavalry charges, no clever tactical innovations. Just thousands of men trying to kill each other in a confined space while their comrades shoved from behind. Alfred held the line. The sources don't give us details of the fighting. No individual heroics, no dramatic turning points, no speeches that turned the tide. What they tell us is simple. The West Saxons stood their ground, and eventually the Vikings couldn't take it anymore. The Danish shield wall broke. When a shield wall collapsed, the battle turned into a rout. The formation that had protected the warriors now worked against them. Men who had been shoulder to shoulder were suddenly exposed, unable to defend themselves as their comrades fled. The West Saxons pursued, cutting down the retreating Vikings as they ran. Guthrum escaped the slaughter and retreated to a nearby fortress, probably the same fortified position at Chippenham that he had seized 5 months earlier. Alfred followed and laid siege. For 2 weeks, the King of Wessex surrounded his enemy and waited. The Vikings had no relief coming. Their army had been shattered at Edington. Their ships were destroyed or scattered. Guthrum was trapped with the survivors of his force, watching his supplies dwindle and knowing that no rescue was on the way. After 14 days, he surrendered. The terms Alfred offered were extraordinary. He didn't demand the Vikings' destruction. He didn't execute Guthrum or sell his warriors into slavery. Instead, he offered something far more radical. He offered baptism. Guthrum would convert to Christianity. He would accept Alfred as his godfather. He would take a Christian name and become, at least symbolically, a member of the Anglo-Saxon Christian community. It sounds strange to modern ears. Why would a military victory end with a religious ceremony? But Alfred understood something profound about the conflict he had just won. The Vikings weren't going away. Even if he killed Guthrum, more would come. The Danish settlements in Northumbria and East Anglia weren't going to disappear. The future of England would inevitably involve Danes and Saxons living side by side. Baptism was a way of making that future possible. It transformed Guthrum from a pagan invader into a Christian king. It created a framework for coexistence, a shared religious identity that could bridge the gap between the two peoples. It was an act of statesmanship disguised as a religious ritual. 3 weeks after the siege ended, Guthrum was baptized at Alla, near Athelney. Alfred stood as his godfather. The Viking king emerged from the water as Athelstan, his new Christian name. The wars were not over. There would be more fighting in the years to come, more Viking invasions, more crises. But something fundamental had changed. The great heathen army's dream of conquering all England had died at Edington. Wessex had survived, and Alfred had earned his epithet, the Great. The baptism at Alla was only the beginning. For 12 days after the ceremony, Guthrum, now Athelstan, remained at Alfred's court, participating in the rituals and celebrations that accompanied a royal conversion. The two men who had spent years trying to destroy each other now feasted together, exchanged gifts, and negotiated the future of England. Think about the strangeness of that scene. Alfred, who had hidden in swamps while his kingdom collapsed, now hosting the man who had driven him there. Guthrum, who had come within weeks of conquering all England, now kneeling before a Christian priest and renouncing his gods. Warriors from both sides, men who had killed each other's friends and brothers, now sharing mead in the same hall. This was not reconciliation. It was politics. Both men understood that the war had reached a stalemate that neither could break. Alfred had won at Edington, but he didn't have the strength to destroy the Viking presence in England entirely. Guthrum had lost his best chance at conquest, but he still commanded thousands of warriors who controlled vast territories. They needed each other, or at least they needed to stop fighting each other. The result was the Treaty of Wedmore. The exact terms of this first treaty haven't survived, but we know its essential shape. Guthrum agreed to leave Wessex permanently. His people would settle in East Anglia, adding to the Danish populations already established in Northumbria and the Eastern Midlands. There would be peace between the two kingdoms. But a peace treaty is just words. What made it real was the baptism. To understand why baptism mattered so much, you need to understand how medieval people thought about identity. Religion wasn't a private belief you held in your heart. It was a public declaration of who you were, which community you belonged to, which laws you followed. A pagan Dane and a Christian Saxon weren't just worshipping different gods. They were living in different moral universes, bound by different obligations, subject to different rules. Baptism changed that. When Guthrum emerged from the water as Athelstan, he was symbolically joining the Christian community. He was accepting, at least in theory, the same moral framework that governed Alfred's kingdom. He was making himself comprehensible to English society in a way that a pagan warlord never could be. Was it sincere? Probably not, at least not in any deep spiritual sense. Guthrum had spent his entire adult life sacrificing to Odin and Thor. He wasn't suddenly convinced that Jesus was the one true God just because he'd lost a battle. But sincerity wasn't really the point. The point was that both sides could now pretend they were dealing with a fellow Christian ruler rather than a heathen invader. Alfred stood as Guthrum's godfather, which created a spiritual kinship between them. In the eyes of the church, they were now family. Attacking your godson or your godfather was a sin. Violation of sacred bonds. This gave both men a face-saving way to stop fighting without admitting weakness. It was brilliant diplomacy, disguised as religious ritual. A few years later, probably around 886, Alfred and Guthrum formalized the boundary between their territories in a second treaty. This document has survived, and it gives us our clearest picture of how England was divided. The border ran roughly along the old Roman road called Watling Street, then followed the River Lee to its source, and from there to Bedford and along the River Ouse to the boundary with Northumbria. Everything to the northeast of this line, Northumbria, East Anglia, and the eastern portion of Mercia, was Danish territory. Everything to the southwest was English. This was the Danelaw. The name itself tells you everything you need to know. In these territories, Danish law prevailed. Danish customs governed inheritance, land ownership, and the resolution of disputes. Danish lords collected taxes and administered justice. The language of everyday life was increasingly a hybrid of Old Norse and Old English, creating words and phrases that survive in modern English to this day. If you've ever used the words they, them, or their, thank the Vikings. Those pronouns replaced the original Old English forms in regions where Norse and English speakers lived side by side. The original Old English pronouns were he, him, and hera, similar to the singular forms, which caused confusion when people from different linguistic backgrounds tried to communicate. The Norse pronouns were clearer, and they stuck. Words like sky, skin, skull, window, husband, wrong, ugly, happy, knife, die, and hundreds of others entered English through the Danelaw. The Vikings didn't just conquer territory, they changed the language itself. Consider the word law itself. It comes from Old Norse lag. The Anglo-Saxons had their own word, a, but it was gradually replaced by the Scandinavian term in areas of heavy Danish settlement. So, when we talk about the Danelaw, we're using a word that is itself half Danish. Or think about place names. If you see a town in England ending in by, that's from the Old Norse word for farmstead or village. Whitby, Derby, Grimsby, Selby, Rugby. Hundreds of them, scattered across the north and east of England like fingerprints left at a crime scene. Towns ending in thorpe come from the Norse word for hamlet or outlying farm. Scunthorpe, Cleethorpes, Althorpe. Towns ending in thwaite come from the Norse word for clearing or meadow. Braithwaite, Crosthwaite, Satterthwaite. Walk through Yorkshire or Lincolnshire today, and you're walking through a landscape that Vikings named. They've been gone for 1,000 years, but their words are still on the road signs. The treaty also established something remarkable for its time: legal equality between Danes and English. One clause specifies that a Danish freedman and an English freedman had equal value in legal terms. If one killed the other, the same compensation was owed, regardless of which side the victim came from. This was not standard practice in the early medieval world, where legal systems typically valued people from the dominant group more highly than outsiders. The compensation for killing a free man in both Danish and English systems was called wergild, literally man payment. It was the price of a human life, paid to the victim's family to prevent blood feuds from spiraling out of control. Different social classes had different wergilds. A nobleman was worth more than a peasant. A king's thane was worth more than a common farmer. But under the treaty, a Danish farmer and an English farmer were worth the same. A Danish merchant and an English merchant were worth the same. This created a framework for two peoples to live alongside each other without constant disputes about whose laws applied to whom. Alfred and Guthrum were building something new, a framework for coexistence that acknowledged the reality of a divided England. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always followed. Violence continued, disputes arose, but the treaty represented an attempt to move beyond simple conquest towards something like a functioning society. The Danelaw would remain a distinct region of England for nearly a century. Its towns had different names: Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham and Stamford became known as the Five Boroughs, centres of Danish power in the Midlands. These weren't just military outposts. They were thriving commercial centres, connected by trade routes that stretched from the North Sea to the Irish Sea and beyond. The Vikings had always been traders as much as raiders. The same ships that carried warriors to plunder monasteries also carried merchants to buy and sell goods. The Danelaw became a hub of international commerce, with goods flowing in from Scandinavia, the Baltic, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world. Archaeological finds from Viking Age York, Jorvik as the Danes called it, reveal a cosmopolitan city that would have amazed the Anglo-Saxons who had lived there before. Arabic coins, Byzantine silk, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory from the Arctic, jet from Whitby, glass beads from the Rhineland. The Vikings weren't just conquerors. They were the great connectors of the early medieval world. The legal customs of the Danelaw persisted long after the political boundaries faded. Even today, the distribution of Scandinavian place names across England traces the outline of where the descendants of the great heathen army settled. But the Danelaw was never entirely stable. It was a patchwork of different lords, different towns, different interests. The various Danish rulers often fought among themselves as much as they fought the English. And to the southwest, Wessex was growing stronger. Alfred spent the years after Eddington not just defending his kingdom, but transforming it. The near disaster of 878 had taught him a painful lesson. The traditional Anglo-Saxon military system, where farmers put down their ploughs and picked up their spears when the king called, was too slow and too unreliable to face a mobile, professional enemy like the Vikings. By the time the Fyrd assembled, the Vikings had already struck and moved on. Alfred's solution was revolutionary. He reorganized the military so that at any given time, half of the eligible warriors were on active duty, while the other half worked their farms. This rotation system meant that there was always an army in the field, ready to respond to threats. The Vikings could no longer count on catching Wessex unprepared. He also built a network of fortified towns called burhs. These weren't just defensive positions, they were planned communities with permanent garrisons, regular street grids, and space for the local population to take shelter during attacks. Alfred spaced them so that no one in Wessex was ever more than 20 miles from a burh. If the Vikings attacked, people could reach safety within a day's travel. The burhs were expensive. They required constant maintenance, permanent garrisons, and a logistical system to supply them. Alfred funded them through a reform of the tax system that made landowners responsible for the defense of specific sections of wall based on the size of their holdings. It was a comprehensive reorganization of society around the demands of war. And it worked. When the Vikings returned in the 890s, a new generation of raiders who hadn't learned the lessons of Eddington, they found Wessex a much harder target. Towns that would have fallen in a week now held out for months. Armies that would have taken weeks to assemble now appeared within days. The element of surprise that the Vikings had always relied on was gone. Alfred also built a fleet. The Anglo-Saxons had never been great sailors. They had left the sea to the Vikings almost by default. Alfred commissioned new ships, larger than the traditional Viking longships, designed specifically to counter Norse naval tactics. They weren't always successful. Naval warfare was not Wessex's strength, but they represented an attempt to challenge Viking dominance of the waters around Britain. But Alfred's legacy went beyond military reform. He was also a scholar, or at least a patron of scholars. He lamented the decline of learning in England, the destruction of the monasteries that had been centres of education before the Viking raids. He personally translated works of philosophy and history from Latin into English, making them accessible to people who couldn't read the learned language of the church. Learning had declined so thoroughly in England, Alfred wrote, that there were very few men on this side of the Humber who could understand their divine services in English, or even translate a single letter from Latin into English. This was an exaggeration, but not by much. The Viking raids had devastated the monasteries where literacy was preserved. Libraries had burned. Monks had been killed or scattered. The infrastructure of learning had been systematically dismantled. Alfred saw the restoration of education as essential to the restoration of his kingdom. An ignorant people could not defend themselves. They could not understand their laws, their history, their faith. They could not be good subjects or good Christians. So he founded schools. He attracted scholars from the continent and from other parts of Britain. He commissioned translations of works he considered essential: Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Bede's Ecclesiastical History. He created the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of English history that would be maintained for centuries. The English language itself bears Alfred's mark. Before his reign, most serious writing in England was done in Latin. Alfred promoted writing in English, legitimizing the vernacular as a vehicle for literature and learning. The English tradition of writing philosophy and history in the common language rather than in Latin, a tradition that would eventually produce everything from Chaucer to Shakespeare to the King James Bible, traces its roots to Alfred's court. When Alfred died in 899, he passed to his son Edward a kingdom that was stronger, better organized, and better defended than the one he had inherited. The fumbling, desperate king who had hidden in the marshes of Somerset was gone. In his place was Alfred the Great, the only English king to be called great, and the man who had saved his kingdom from extinction. Edward and his successors would complete what Alfred had started. But what of the men who started it all? The sons of Ragnar had launched the invasion that reshaped England. They had killed kings, conquered kingdoms, and set in motion events that would echo for centuries. By 878, most of them had vanished from the historical record, their fates uncertain, their legends only beginning to grow. Let's account for them one by one. Ivar the Boneless, the mastermind, the strategist who had planned the destruction of Northumbria. He disappears from English sources after the conquest of East Anglia in 869. This is one of the great mysteries of the Viking Age. The most brilliant military commander of his generation simply vanishes from the English chronicles. No death is recorded, no final battle. He's there in 869, helping to oversee the martyrdom of King Edmund, and then he's gone. Irish annals may pick up his trail. They record a king of the Dublin Vikings named Eamar, who was active in Ireland during the same period. This Eamar was a dominant figure in the Irish Sea region, leading raids, building alliances, and establishing a dynasty that would control Dublin for generations. Many historians believe Eamar and Ivar are the same person. The names are linguistically related. Eamar is simply the Irish form of Ivar. The timing works, and it would explain where Ivar went after 869. If this identification is correct, then Ivar left England after securing revenge for his father and spent his final years building a kingdom in Ireland. He would have ruled Dublin, controlled the lucrative Irish slave trade, and projected power across the Irish Sea. Not a bad retirement for a man who couldn't walk. The Annals of Ulster describe Eamar's death in 873 with a phrase that captures the ambiguity surrounding him. Eamar, King of the Northmen of all Ireland and Britain, ended his life. King of the Northmen of all Ireland and Britain. That's quite a title. Whether it reflects actual political control or simply the chronicler's recognition of his legendary status, we can't know. What we can say is that Ivar never saw the final conquest of England he had planned. He left before the job was done, and by the time of Eddington, he was almost certainly dead. The brilliant strategist who had exploited Northumbria's civil war and planned the systematic dismantling of Anglo-Saxon England missed the moment when it all fell apart. Perhaps that's fitting. Ivar was always better at destroying than building. The settlement of the Danelaw, the compromise with Alfred, the transformation of warriors into farmers, these were not the kinds of achievements that would have interested him. He was a conqueror, and conquerors rarely make good administrators. But his legacy persisted. The descendants of Eamar, The Eemar, as the Irish called them, would dominate the Irish Sea region for over a century. They would rule Dublin, contest the throne of York, and remain a force in British politics long after most people had forgotten where they came from. If Ivar the Boneless and Eemar of Dublin were the same man, then his dynasty outlasted all of his brother's achievements. The crippled mastermind who was carried into battle on a shield became the founder of a royal line. Halfdan Ragnarsson, the relentless commander who had led the army through years of campaigns, chose a different path. After the conquest of East Anglia and the long wars against Wessex, Halfdan took his portion of the army to Northumbria and settled down. In 876, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Halfdan shared out the land of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. This single sentence describes one of the most significant transformations in English history. The warriors who had conquered Northumbria, men who had spent their adult lives raiding, fighting, and killing, were now farmers. They weren't leaving. They weren't moving on to the next conquest. They were staying, permanently, putting down roots in the land they had seized. The distribution must have been a massive undertaking. Thousands of warriors, each expecting a share of the conquered territory. Land that had belonged to English nobles, English farmers, English churches. All of it now subject to redistribution among the Danish invaders. We don't know the details. Did they simply expel the previous owners? Did they take over existing farms and reduce the English to tenant status? Did they carve out new holdings from uncultivated land? Probably all of the above, varying from place to place and lord to lord. What we do know is that the settlement was permanent. The Danish warriors who had terrified England for a decade became the ancestors of Yorkshire farmers. Their descendants would work the same land for generations, gradually intermarrying with the English population until the distinction between Dane and Saxon became meaningless. But Halfdan himself didn't stay. The Irish annals record that in 877, a Viking leader named Alban was killed in a battle at Strangford Lough in Ireland. Most historians identify Alban as Halfdan. If they're right, then Halfdan couldn't resist the call of one more campaign. He left his settlers in Northumbria and crossed the Irish Sea, perhaps seeking new conquests, perhaps drawn by the same restlessness that had driven his father to invade England with only 2 ships. The battle at Strangford Lough was part of a larger conflict over control of the Dublin kingdom. Halfdan may have been trying to muscle in on his brother Ivar's territory, or contesting the succession after Ivar's death, or pursuing some other agenda that the sources don't explain. Whatever the reason, it cost him his life. He died in battle, far from the kingdom he had helped create. There's something poignant about that. Halfdan had done the hard work of conquest and settlement. He had transformed raiders into farmers, warriors into subjects. And then, when the work was done, he couldn't stop. He crossed the sea to fight one more war and never came back. The settlers he left behind barely noticed. They were too busy ploughing their fields. Bjorn Ironside, the legendary raider of the Mediterranean, is the most difficult to trace. His Mediterranean expedition in the early 860s is well documented. The raids on Spain, North Africa, and southern France. The sack of Luna that he mistook for Rome. But after that, the sources become frustratingly vague. Some traditions suggest he returned to Scandinavia after the initial invasion of England and became a king in Sweden. The Norse sagas claim he founded a dynasty that ruled for generations. The Swedish royal house, in later centuries, traced its ancestry back to Bjorn Ironside, and through him to Ragnar Lothbrok. Other sources aren't sure he participated in the English campaigns at all, beyond the first year or two. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't mention him by name in any of the battles after the conquest of Northumbria. He may have returned to Scandinavia before the long slog against Wessex began. This actually makes sense when you think about Bjorn's character. He was an adventurer, man who sailed into unknown waters just to see what was there. The grinding territorial warfare against Wessex, the sieges, the standoffs, the endless negotiations. That wasn't his style. He wanted horizons, not hedgerows. If the sagas are to be believed, Bjorn returned to Scandinavia and ruled as a king until his death. He was supposedly buried in a great mound at a place called Håga, near modern Uppsala. Archaeologists have excavated mounds in the area, finding rich grave goods that suggest royal burials, but none have been definitively linked to Bjorn. What's certain is that Bjorn's legend grew far beyond whatever his actual deeds might have been. He became a symbol of Viking ambition, the man who had sailed farther than any Northman before him, who had raided coasts that most Scandinavians couldn't even imagine. Whether he lived to old age in a Swedish hall or died in some unrecorded battle, his name outlived him. Later sagas would credit him with everything from the founding of dynasties to the establishment of trade routes. He became less a historical figure than an archetype, the Viking as explorer, as pioneer, as restless spirit always seeking the next horizon. In the popular imagination, Bjorn Ironside might be the most famous of Ragnar's sons. The television series Vikings made him a central character. Modern novels and games feature him prominently. But the historical Bjorn remains elusive. A handful of chronicle entries, a Mediterranean raid, and then silence. Perhaps that's appropriate. The man who sailed beyond the known world disappeared beyond the edge of the historical record. Sigurd Snake in the Eye reportedly returned to Denmark after the conquest of Northumbria. Later traditions claim he became a king there, ruling the lands his father had once sailed from. The stories about Sigurd are particularly difficult to verify because they're so thoroughly mixed with mythology. That mark in his eye, the serpent eating its own tail, was supposed to prove his descent from the legendary Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. Every story about him is filtered through this mythological lens, making it nearly impossible to separate fact from legend. What the later sources claim is that Sigurd married a woman named Blasia, supposedly a daughter of King Ella of Northumbria. Yes, the same Ella his brothers had killed, the same Ella who had thrown their father into a snake pit. If this is true, and it's a significant if, then Viking politics were even more complex than we usually imagine. The daughter of the man they came to destroy married into the family of her father's killers. It would have been a way of legitimizing Danish rule over Northumbria, connecting the conquerors to the old royal line. Or it might have been a completely invented genealogy, designed to give later Danish kings a claim to English territory. According to the sagas, Sigurd died in battle against a rival king. His descendants supposedly included later Danish kings, and even, through complicated genealogies, some of the Norwegian royal line. The various Scandinavian royal houses were enthusiastic about tracing their ancestry back to Ragnar Lothbrok, and Sigurd provided a convenient link. But by this point, we're deep in the territory of legend, where saga writers were more interested in constructing impressive family trees than recording accurate history. The real Sigurd Snake in the Eye, whoever he was, has been buried under layers of mythology and dynastic propaganda. What we can say is that he survived the English campaigns and returned to Scandinavia. Unlike his brothers who died in battle or disappeared into obscurity, Sigurd seems to have lived out his life in relative peace. For a son of Ragnar Lothbrok, that might be the strangest fate of all. Ubbe died in England, but not in the main campaigns of the Great Heathen Army. In 878, around the same time Alfred was hiding in the marshes of Somerset, Ubbe led a Viking force into Devon. He came by sea with 23 ships, landing on the northern coast of the peninsula with perhaps 1,000 warriors. The timing suggests coordination with Guthrum. While Guthrum's army pressed Alfred from the east, Ubbe would attack from the west, catching Wessex in a pincer movement. If it had worked, Alfred would have faced enemies on two fronts, with nowhere to retreat. The swamps of Somerset, which had provided refuge, would have become a trap. It didn't work. A local ealdorman named Odda gathered the men of Devon and confronted Ubbe's army at a place called Kinwit, possibly Countisbury Hill in North Devon. The English were outnumbered. Odda had only a local levy, not a royal army, but they held a fortified position on a hilltop. The hilltop had walls, but no water supply. Ubbe apparently decided to starve them out rather than assault the walls. It was a reasonable decision. Time was on his side. Eventually, the English would have to come out or die of thirst. But Odda didn't wait. At dawn, before the Vikings were fully awake, he led his men in a desperate sortie. The surprise attack caught Ubbe's army scattered and unprepared. What followed was a slaughter. Ubba was killed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that 800 Vikings died with him, though that number is probably exaggerated. The survivors fled to their ships and escaped, but the Western invasion was over. Among the trophies the English captured was the Raven Banner, the legendary standard said to have been woven by the daughters of Ragnar Lothbrok. The saga traditions claimed that the banner had magical properties. If the Vikings were destined to win, the raven on the banner would seem to flutter and fly. If they were destined to lose, it would hang limp and still. The banner hung still at Kinwit. It was a fitting end for the last of Ragnar's sons to die in England. Ubba fell not in some epic confrontation with Alfred, but in a secondary campaign in Devon, killed by a local lord whose name most people have never heard. The sons of Ragnar had dreamed of conquering all England, and the last of them to die in pursuit of that dream was cut down in a skirmish that barely rates a paragraph in most history books. The Raven Banner was lost to history after that. Perhaps it was destroyed. Perhaps it was preserved as a trophy in some English church or noble hall. Perhaps it rotted away in obscurity. The magical standard of Ragnar's daughters disappeared, along with the last of his sons to fight in England. And so they passed from history, one by one. Ivar, probably to Ireland and a throne in Dublin, dead by 873. Halfdan, to settlement, and then to a pointless battle in Ireland, dead by 877. Bjorn, perhaps to Scandinavia and legend, his death unrecorded. Sigurd, to Denmark and dynastic marriage, his end unknown. Ubba, to a hillside in Devon and an unmarked grave, dead in 878. Within a decade of Eddington, every son of Ragnar who had led the great heathen army was gone. The revenge they had sworn in their father's name was complete. Ella was dead, Northumbria had fallen, but the larger goal of conquering all England had slipped away. They got their vengeance. They got their kingdoms. And in the end, they got exactly what every Viking secretly wanted. A story worth telling. We're still telling it. So what did it all mean? The great heathen army landed in 865 with dreams of conquest and revenge. By 878, those dreams had partially succeeded and partially failed. They had destroyed Northumbria and East Anglia as independent kingdoms. They had humbled Mercia. They had come within a hair's breadth of conquering Wessex. But in the end, Alfred survived, and that survival changed everything. Let's trace the consequences. In the short term, the invasion created the Danelaw, a vast swathe of England under Danish law and Danish settlement. For nearly a century, England was effectively divided into two zones, the Danish northeast and the English southwest. This division could have become permanent. England might have evolved into two separate nations, like the various kingdoms that emerged from the Carolingian Empire on the continent. Scandinavia's reach might have become permanent across half of Britain. The precedents were there. France had ceded Normandy to Vikings in 911, and that territory remained distinct for centuries. Ireland had multiple Viking kingdoms that persisted alongside Gaelic ones. Scotland's Western Isles were under Norse control for hundreds of years. There was no inevitable reason why England should have been reunified, but Alfred's successors had other plans. The reconquest began almost immediately after Alfred's death. His son Edward, known to history as Edward the Elder, inherited a kingdom that was stronger than the one Alfred had inherited. The military reforms, the burhs, the administrative reorganization, all of it was in place and ready to be used offensively rather than defensively. Edward began pushing into Danish territory almost immediately. He was aided by his sister Ethelflad, one of the most remarkable women in medieval history. Ethelflad was married to the ealdorman of Mercia, but when her husband became ill, she took over effective control of the kingdom. When he died in 911, she ruled in her own right as the Lady of the Mercians. She was not technically a queen. Mercia was subordinate to Wessex, and her brother was her overlord. But she commanded armies, built fortifications, and conquered Danish territories alongside Edward. Together, brother and sister launched a systematic campaign to dismantle the Danelaw. They didn't try to conquer everything at once. Instead, they built burhs at strategic points, establishing fortified positions that could control the surrounding territory. Each burh became a base for the next advance. Slowly, methodically, they pushed the frontier northward and eastward. Derby fell in 917. Leicester submitted in 918. Nottingham was taken the same year. The 5 boroughs, the centres of Danish power in the Midlands, fell one by one. Ethelflad died in 918, just as the reconquest was reaching its climax. Edward took over her territories and continued the campaign. By the time of his own death in 924, most of the Danelaw south of the Humber was under English control. Edward's son Athelstan finished the job. In 927, he conquered York, the last independent Viking kingdom in England. For the first time in history, a single king ruled all of England. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex united under one crown. Athelstan styled himself King of the English. Not King of the West Saxons, not King of this territory or that. King of the English. A national identity was being born. Think about what that means. The Viking invasion that was supposed to destroy Anglo-Saxon England ended up creating it. Before 865, there was no England. There were 4 separate kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, that happened to share an island and a language. They fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. The idea that they were one nation, one people, would have seemed strange to most of their inhabitants. A man from Wessex would have identified as a West Saxon. A man from Northumbria would have identified as a Northumbrian. They might acknowledge a shared ancestry. They all traced their origins back to the Germanic tribes who had invaded Britain centuries earlier. But they didn't think of themselves as belonging to a single nation called England. The Great Heathen Army changed that. By conquering 3 of those kingdoms, the Vikings inadvertently made Wessex the only viable centre of English resistance. Alfred fought not just as a West Saxon king, but as the defender of Christian England against pagan invaders. The language of his court began to shift from regional to national. The chronicles he commissioned told the story of the English resisting the Danes. When Alfred's descendants reconquered the Danelaw, they did so as kings of the English, not merely as kings of the West Saxons. The reconquest wasn't framed as one kingdom absorbing others. It was framed as the liberation of English territories from Danish occupation. This was partly propaganda, of course. The people of Northumbria and East Anglia hadn't historically been English in any meaningful sense. But propaganda has a way of becoming reality. By the time of Athelstan, the idea of a unified English nation had taken hold in a way that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The sons of Ragnar came to destroy England, and instead, they built it. The Danish legacy persisted even after the political reconquest. The settlers who had come with the great heathen army and the waves of migrants who followed didn't disappear when English kings took over. They stayed on their farms, in their towns, speaking their hybrid language and following their modified customs. Their descendants married into English families. Their words entered English speech. Their genes entered the English population. Modern genetic studies have found significant Scandinavian ancestry in the populations of northern and eastern England, exactly the regions where the great heathen army settled. A man from York today is likely to have more Viking DNA than a man from London. The invasion left a mark on the very genetic makeup of the English people, and the cultural impact went even deeper. The Vikings brought a different attitude toward law. In Scandinavian society, legal disputes were settled at public assemblies called things, where free men gathered to hear cases and render judgments. This tradition persisted in the Danelaw, influencing the development of English legal customs. The concept of the jury, a group of local people deciding guilt or innocence, may have Scandinavian roots. The Vikings brought a different attitude toward trade. The Danelaw towns became commercial centres, linked to trading networks that stretched across the North Sea and beyond. York was one of the largest cities in England precisely because of its connections to Scandinavian commerce. The Vikings even brought different attitudes towards social hierarchy. Scandinavian society was more fluid than Anglo-Saxon society in some ways. A man could rise through ability and accomplishment rather than purely through birth. This influence is harder to trace, but some historians see it in the relative openness of later English society compared to more rigidly stratified continental kingdoms. Even English royalty would eventually acquire a Viking tinge. In 1013, almost exactly 150 years after the great heathen army landed, a Danish king named Sweyn Forkbeard successfully conquered all of England. His son Canute would rule an empire that stretched from England, Denmark, to Norway. The descendants of the Vikings had finally achieved what the sons of Ragnar could not. They conquered all of England, not through a single invasion, but through generations of settlement, integration, and eventual military success. But by then, the distinction between English and Danish had become blurred almost beyond recognition. Canute ruled not as a foreign conqueror, but as a Christian king, respecting English laws and customs, patronizing English churches, and presenting himself as the legitimate heir to a tradition that stretched back to Alfred. The Vikings had been absorbed into the nation they had tried to destroy. What happened to the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok himself? It only grew. The sagas that told his story were written down centuries after his death, in Iceland and Norway and Denmark, embellished with each retelling, mixing whatever historical truth might have existed with mythology, folklore, and pure invention. Ragnar became a symbol of the Viking Age itself, bold, audacious, destined for greatness and tragedy. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, probably composed in Iceland in the 13th century, presents him as the greatest hero of his age. It traces his lineage back to legendary figures, gives him magical companions and impossible victories, and culminates in the famous death song he supposedly sang in Allah's snake pit. That death song, the crackle, or Lay of Cracker, became one of the most famous poems of the medieval Norse world. It's probably not authentic. It was likely composed long after Ragnar's supposed death, possibly as late as the 12th century. But it captured something essential about the Viking worldview. The poem is structured as Ragnar's reflection on his life as he dies. Verse after verse, he recounts his battles, his victories, the enemies he killed, and the treasures he won. There's no regret, no fear, no pleading for mercy. Just a warrior looking back on a life well lived by his own standards. The final verses are the ones everyone remembers. It gladdens me to know that Balder's father makes ready the benches for a banquet. Soon we shall be drinking ale from the curved horns. The champion who comes into Odin's dwelling does not lament his death. I shall not enter his hall with words of fear upon my lips. The Aesir will welcome me. Death comes without lamenting. Eager am I to depart. The Disir summon me home, those whom Odin sends for me from the halls of the Lord of Hosts. Gladly shall I drink ale in the high seat with the Aesir. The days of my life are ended. I laugh as I die. I laugh as I die. That's the Viking spirit in a single line. No fear of death, no grovelling before enemies, just defiance, pride, and the certainty that a glorious afterlife awaits in Odin's hall. Whether Ragnar ever said anything like this is irrelevant. The poem captured what the Vikings wanted to believe about themselves, and it made Ragnar the embodiment of their ideals. His sons became archetypes as well. Ivar, the cunning cripple, who conquered through intelligence rather than strength. He became a symbol of the mind's power over the body's limitations. Later stories expanded his legend, claiming he had been carried not just into battle, but across entire kingdoms, directing campaigns from his shield like a general from his command tent. Bjorn, the adventurer, who sailed beyond the known world. He became the Viking as explorer, as pioneer, as restless spirit, always seeking the next horizon. His Mediterranean expedition grew more elaborate with each retelling, adding encounters with exotic peoples and fabulous treasures. Halfdan, the steady commander who turned warriors into settlers. He represented the other side of the Viking experience. Not just raiding, but building. Not just destroying, but creating. The farmers of Yorkshire could trace their ancestry back to a son of Ragnar, and that connection gave their ordinary lives a touch of legend. Sigurd, with the dragon mark in his eye, linking the family to the mythological past. He represented the Vikings' belief in fate, in signs and portents, in the idea that some people were marked for greatness from birth. Ubba, the fierce, the last to die in England, who never stopped fighting. He represented the Viking who couldn't adapt, who lived by the sword and died by it, who belonged to an age that was passing away. Together, the sons of Ragnar became a complete picture of the Viking world, its brilliance and its brutality, its ambition and its limitations, its achievements and its ultimate failure to hold what it had won. The great heathen army itself became legend. The phrase entered popular culture, evoking images of longships and shield walls, of pagan warriors crashing against Christian kingdoms, of an age when history was written in blood. Modern novels, television shows, video games and movies have all drawn on the story. The History Channel's Vikings series brought Ragnar and his sons to a global audience, mixing historical details with saga traditions and pure invention. The reality was more complicated than the legend, of course. The great heathen army wasn't a single unified force with a single unified purpose. It was a coalition of different warbands with different leaders, held together by opportunity and kinship, but prone to fracture when those bonds weakened. The sons of Ragnar provided a unifying mythology, but the actual army was a diverse and shifting entity. And the Vikings themselves were more complicated than their reputation suggests. Yes, they raided and killed and enslaved, but they also traded, explored, and settled. They were farmers as well as warriors, poets as well as pirates. The same culture that produced the blood eagle also produced the sagas, some of the finest literature of the medieval world. The monks who wrote the chronicles focused on the violence because that's what affected them. When Vikings showed up at a monastery, they weren't interested in having a nuanced cultural exchange. They were there to steal the gold and take the monks as slaves. The survivors wrote their accounts from that perspective, and those accounts shaped how we remember the Vikings. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. The Viking settlements in England weren't military camps. They were farms, workshops, trading posts. The people who lived there weren't constantly at war. They were raising children, growing crops, making shoes and combs and jewelry. They were living ordinary lives in a new land. The great heathen army was the dramatic beginning, but the settlement that followed was the real transformation. The warriors became farmers. The raiders became traders. The pagans became Christians. And over generations, the Danes became English. Let me leave you with one final thought. The great heathen army was not a natural disaster. It was not some inevitable force that swept across England like a storm. It was made up of individuals, men who made choices, who could have chosen differently, who shaped history through their decisions. Ragnar, if he existed, chose to invade Northumbria with 2 ships, when a smarter man might have stayed home. He was driven by pride, or restlessness, or a death wish dressed up as ambition. That choice, unnecessary, irrational, almost suicidal, set everything in motion. Allah chose to execute Ragnar in a way designed to send a message. A quick beheading would have ended the matter. Instead, he chose the snake pit, chose humiliation, chose to create martyrs. He thought he was warning the Vikings to stay away. Instead, he gave them a cause. The sons chose revenge over acceptance. They could have mourned their father and moved on. Vikings died in raids all the time, but they chose to make his death the foundation of something larger, to transform a personal loss into a military campaign, to channel their grief into conquest. Ivar chose to exploit Northumbria's civil war rather than attack directly. A less patient commander might have sailed straight to York and demanded blood. Ivar waited, watched, and struck when his enemies were weakest. That strategic patience was the difference between a raid and a conquest. Alfred chose to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. In the swamps of Somerset, with his kingdom collapsed around him, he could have fled to the continent like other defeated kings. He chose to stay, to hide, to rebuild. That choice saved Wessex and eventually created England. Guthrum chose to accept baptism when he could have fought to the death. The treaty at Wedmore wasn't inevitable. A different Viking leader might have refused to bend, might have preferred death in battle to submission at a font. Guthrum chose survival, and that choice ended the conquest. History is not inevitable. It's made by people, one decision at a time. The England that exists today, its language, its laws, its culture, its very genetic makeup, was shaped by choices made in muddy fields and smoky halls 12 centuries ago. The sons of Ragnar could not have imagined the world their invasion would create. They wanted revenge for their father. They wanted kingdoms for themselves. They wanted glory that would outlast their deaths and be sung of in halls across the Norse world. They got all of that, but they also got something they never intended. They got a unified England that rose from the ashes of their conquest. They got a language enriched by their words. They got descendants who forgot they were ever Danish, who became as English as anyone. Alfred could not have known that his survival would lay the foundation for a nation. He was just trying to get through the next battle, the next winter, the next crisis. He was hiding in swamps and burning cakes and desperately rallying whatever men would still follow him. And somehow, out of all that chaos and violence and uncertainty, something lasting emerged. That's the real story of the great heathen army. Not just conquest and revenge, but transformation. Not just destruction, but the strange, painful, bloody process by which one world ends and another begins. The year was 865 when they came. Long ships on the horizon, raven banners in the wind. Warriors who believed their father was waiting for them in Odin's hall, watching to see if they were worthy of the name they carried. They came for revenge, and they got it. Allah died. Northumbria fell. The snake pit was avenged. They came for conquest, and they got that too. 3 kingdoms fell. The Danelaw was born. For a moment, it seemed like all of England would become a Scandinavian province. But they didn't come for what they actually achieved. They didn't come to create a unified England, to enrich the English language, to plant their genes in the soil of Yorkshire. They didn't come to be absorbed into the very nation they tried to destroy. Yet, that's what happened. By the time the last son of Ragnar died, the map of Britain had been redrawn. But the map would be redrawn again and again in the centuries to come. And each redrawing would carry the marks of what the Vikings had done. The snake pit where Ragnar died, if it ever existed, is lost to history. No one knows where Allah's court was, where the execution took place, where the old boar breathed his last. The location has been forgotten, swallowed by time. The blood eagle that may or may not have been carved into Allah's back has become the stuff of horror movies and heavy metal album covers. It lives now in popular culture rather than historical record, more symbol than fact. The burned cakes that Alfred may or may not have neglected are remembered when his military reforms are forgotten. The greatest king in English history is best known for a story that probably never happened. That's how legend works. The facts fade, but the stories remain. And the stories
about Ragnar and his sons, about Alfred and his survival, about the great heathen army and its transformation, those stories are still being told. They're being told because they have everything a story needs: vengeance, ambition, brothers fighting side by side, a father's death that demands an answer, a king brought low and risen again, the clash of worlds, pagan and Christian, Norse and English, the old ways and the new. They're being told because the Vikings knew how to tell a story. They valued fame above almost everything else. The worst fate a Norse warrior could imagine was to be forgotten, to die without leaving a story behind. By that measure, Ragnar and his sons achieved something like immortality. We're still saying their names 1,200 years later. And they're being told because, in some strange way, the story never really ended. Every time someone visits York and walks streets that Vikings walked, every time someone uses a word that came from Old Norse, every time someone looks at a map of England and sees the ghost of the Danelaw in the place names of the north, every time someone sits down, as you have tonight, and lets the hours slip away while listening to tales of a world that vanished long ago. The great heathen army is gone. The sons of Ragnar are dust. The kingdoms they fought over have merged and split and merged again, transformed beyond recognition by centuries of change. But the story lives. It lives in the language you speak and the land you may live on. It lives in the genes of millions of people who have no idea they carry Viking blood. It lives in the institutions and customs and habits of thought that grew from the world the invasion created. It lives because some things are too important to forget. And now, as the hour grows late and the night settles in around you, let the words fade away. Let the battles and the blood and the long ago struggles of kings and warriors drift into the background. The sons of Ragnar have had their vengeance. Alfred has had his victory. The Danelaw has risen and fallen and become part of something larger. And you, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever brought you here tonight, you've been part of it too. You've walked through the snake pit and stood on the walls of York. You've hidden in the marshes with Alfred and charged at Eddington with the Fyrd of Wessex. You've watched an army of conquerors become farmers and a kingdom of warriors become a nation. That's the magic of history. The past isn't really past. It lives on in the words we speak, the places we live, the stories we tell. It lives in us, whether we know it or not. The Vikings understood that. They believed that fame was the only immortality a person could achieve. The body died. The gods themselves would die at Ragnarok. But a story well told could last forever. Ragnar's story has lasted 12 centuries. His son's story has lasted 12 centuries. And now, in some small way, their story has become part of your story too. You've listened. You've imagined. You've spent these hours in a world of longships and shield walls, of snake pits and raven banners, of kings who fell and kingdoms that rose from the ashes. That makes you part of the chain, the next link in a story that started around campfires in Scandinavia, that was written down in Icelandic halls, that was passed through books and films, and now through voices in the night. Ragnar would have approved. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his death to mean something. He wanted the world to know his name. 1,200 years later, we're still saying it. So rest now. Let the Vikings sail back into the mist. Let Alfred hang up his sword. Let England sleep. The warriors have found their rest, whether in Odin's hall or Christian heaven, or simply in the quiet earth of the lands they conquered. The battles are over. The revenge is complete. The transformation is done. And if you dream tonight of longships on the horizon, of raven banners snapping in the wind, of a father's death song echoing through the halls of Northumbria, well, that's just the story doing what stories do, living on, finding new minds to inhabit, refusing to be forgotten. The sons of Ragnar would understand. They fought for exactly this, not just for land or gold or revenge, but for the chance to be remembered, the chance to matter, the chance to look across the gulf of centuries and find someone still listening. You've given them that tonight. And maybe, somewhere beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead, the old boar is smiling. His piglets did well. They grunted loud enough to be heard across 1,000 years. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope these hours have been a worthy escape from whatever the waking world demanded of you today. I hope the story found you when you needed it and gave you what you came for, whether that was history or entertainment or simply a voice to carry you towards sleep. The great heathen army has marched back into the past. The sons of Ragnar have returned to legend. The battles are silent. The kings are at peace. And England sleeps under stars that the Vikings once navigated by. But the story remains. It always remains. And whenever you want to hear it again, it will be here, waiting, ready to transport you back to an age of fire and iron, of courage and cruelty, of a world being unmade and remade by the ambitions of mortal men. Until then, rest well, dream deep, and remember, somewhere in your blood, in your language, in the very shape of the world you live in, the Vikings are still with you. They never really left. Sweet dreams.